When we talk about building inner strength, the conversation often starts with mindset, motivation, or grit. But those are psychological outputs. What's more fundamental, more powerful, is understanding the underlying physiology that gives rise to those traits. Inner strength begins in the body, specifically in how well your nervous system is calibrated to handle stress. The human nervous system has two primary branches that control how we respond to the world around us. The sympathetic nervous system, which ramps us up into alertness and readiness, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms us down and restores balance. Inner strength is not about shutting off the stress response. It's about being able to access calm when you need it, even in the face of intense pressure. Most people walk around with a chronically elevated level of sympathetic tone, meaning their bodies and brains are primed for stress all the time. This leads to poor decision making, emotional volatility, fatigue, and eventually burnout. But there are very specific tools and protocols we can use to retrain the nervous system to stay grounded, even when the world around us feels chaotic. One of the most effective tools is a breathing pattern called the physiological sigh. This is something your body naturally does during sleep and crying, and it's been shown to be the fastest way to reduce autonomic arousal. It works like this. You take one deep inhale through the nose, then a second shorter inhale on top of that, followed by a long, extended exhale through the mouth. That second inhale is key. It re-expands the alveoli in your lungs, which get collapsed under stress. The extended exhale activates the vagus nerve, which in turn slows the heart rate and signals the brain that the body is safe. Just one or two of these sighs can bring you back to baseline within seconds. This isn't just about feeling better in the moment. When you practice this repeatedly over time, you teach your brain and body that stress does not have to spiral out of control. You begin to rewire your stress response not to avoid pressure, but to regulate it, and that's the foundation of resilience. Another powerful protocol is deliberate cold exposure. When you expose yourself to cold, such as cold showers, ice baths, or even a splash of cold water, you trigger a spike in adrenaline and norepinephrine, but in a controlled setting. This trains your nervous system to experience stress without psychological panic. You're literally conditioning your body to respond to discomfort with clarity, not chaos. Over time, this increases your stress threshold, so things that used to feel overwhelming now feel manageable. But perhaps most important is understanding that your ability to stay calm is a trainable skill. It's not a personality trait you're born with. You don't have to become emotionless. Quite the opposite, true inner strength means you can experience all the sensations of fear, anxiety, or frustration, but you don't let those sensations dictate your actions. You acknowledge them, you breathe, and then you choose your response. Neuroscience has shown that the more often we return to a calm, focused state, especially after being elevated, the more efficient our neural circuits become at making that shift. This is called neuroplasticity, and it means that your ability to stay centered under stress isn't fixed. It gets better with practice, just like lifting weights builds muscle, intentional stress regulation builds neural resilience. If you're looking to build immense inner strength, start with your physiology. Practice the tools that bring your body back into balance. Notice your internal state when things get tense. And more than anything, don't wait for the pressure to disappear before calming yourself. Learn to access calm in the middle of the pressure. That's when it matters most. The more you train your nervous system to stay regulated in the storm, the less you'll be thrown off course by the chaos of life. And over time, this creates something incredibly powerful, not just the appearance of confidence or control, but a deep, unshakable foundation that supports everything you do. That's inner strength, and it starts in the body. Most people think of dopamine as the molecule of pleasure. They imagine it only spikes when we win, when we succeed, when we finally get the thing we've been chasing. But this is a misunderstanding not just of what dopamine does, but of how we can leverage it to build inner strength and long-term resilience. Dopamine is not just about reward. It's about motivation. It's about drive. It's about the pursuit. It's the neuromodulator that tells your brain this is worth doing again. And it's powerful because it doesn't just respond to what happens to us. It responds to where we place our attention and how we interpret our efforts. That means it can be trained. Here's where this becomes critical. If your brain learns to only release dopamine when you hit a goal, when you finish the race, land the promotion, or check off the box, then you're teaching yourself that effort is only worthwhile. It produces an external result over time that creates a fragile system. When results don't come fast, and they often don't, you burn out. You quit. You begin to believe that the work isn't worth it unless there's an immediate payoff. But people who develop immense inner strength do something different. They learn to attach dopamine to the effort itself. In other words, they learn to enjoy the process of doing hard things even when the outcome is uncertain. And this has a real biological basis. When you shift your focus to the challenge and the act of showing up, you actually train your dopamine system to become more resilient and more sustainable. This isn't abstract. This is grounded in how the mesolimbic dopamine pathway works, particularly the projection from the ventral tegmental area VTA to the nucleus accumbens. When you mentally reward yourself for effort, those circuits fire more consistently. You don't have to wait for success to feel motivated. You can generate motivation from within. One of the best tools for doing this is mental reframing. When you're in the middle of something difficult, whether it's a workout, a study session, or even a difficult conversation, say to yourself, "This is the part that makes me stronger," or even more, simply, "I'm doing hard things and that's good." That cognitive shift rewarding the effort in real time sends a signal to your brain that you are moving towards something meaningful, and that process itself is valuable. This might seem small, but it's biologically potent. Studies have shown that when animals or humans associate effort with positive internal feedback, their ability to persist increases dramatically, and not just once. It compounds over time. You become the kind of person who can do the hard reps day after day without needing applause or recognition to keep going. There's also a dark side to dopamine misuse that's worth addressing. We live in an age of constant external stimulation, social media, short-form content, endless novelty. All of these things hijack your dopamine system by providing short, low-effort hits of reward. The problem is, the more you consume those fast dopamine sources, the less sensitive your system becomes. That means when you actually sit down to do real, meaningful work that requires effort and patience, you feel flat, unmotivated, even resistant. So one of the most important things you can do to build inner strength is to protect your dopamine system. That means reducing passive stimulation and increasing active engagement. Don't just consume, create. Don't just chase novelty. Commit to routine. And most importantly, recognize that every time you lean into effort, you're shaping the chemical landscape of your brain. One practical protocol is this. After completing a challenging task, something that required focus and effort, pause and mentally reinforce it. Literally say to yourself, "That was hard. I did it." That's what progress feels like. This sounds simple, but it trains your brain to associate effort with reward, not just the outcome. Over time, this builds a deep reservoir of motivation that doesn't depend on whether or not today's task went perfectly. Effort-based reward is one of the most powerful psychological and neurological tools we have. It allows us to generate motivation from within, to push through discomfort and to stay focused when others quit. It shifts the source of drive from something external to something internal, and once that's in place, you become far less susceptible to failure, frustration, or fatigue. So if you want immense inner strength, train your brain to love the process. Fall in love with the hard work. Teach your nervous system that effort is not something to avoid, but something to pursue. That shift doesn't just change how you feel, it changes how you live. One of the most overlooked components of building inner strength is your relationship to solitude, your ability to be alone with your thoughts, without distraction, without input, and without the need to constantly be stimulated by the outside world. This is not a philosophical idea, it's a neurobiological training ground. It's about deliberately engaging the parts of the brain responsible for self-awareness, future planning, and emotional regulation. In fact, the way you relate to solitude is a direct reflection of how well your mind and nervous system are functioning together. Many people avoid being alone, not because they dislike quiet, but because True solitude brings you face to face with your internal dialogue when external input stops, when you're not scrolling, listening, talking, or reacting. What emerges is your own mind in its raw state. For some, that's uncomfortable, but for those seeking to build true inner resilience, this discomfort is an opportunity. The brain has a network called the default mode network DMN. It becomes most active when you're not focused on the outside world, when your mind is at rest, when you're daydreaming, reflecting, or thinking about yourself or others. For a long time, scientists thought this network was unproductive, but we now know it's essential for functions like introspection, memory consolidation, creativity, and what's called mental time travel, your ability to simulate future outcomes and evaluate past decisions. Training the DMN through solitude strengthens your ability to reflect without spiraling, to plan without overanalyzing, and to be present with yourself without needing constant input. This contributes directly to your cognitive and emotional resilience. There's also a link here to introspection, which is your ability to sense internal signals from your body, heartbeat, breath, temperature, and emotion. When you're constantly distracted, you lose touch with those signals. But in solitude, especially without digital input, you're more likely to note what's happening inside. You might feel tension, fatigue, anxiety, or even calm. And that awareness gives you something crucial: agency. Once you recognize your internal state, you can regulate it. One of the most effective and accessible ways to begin training this capacity is through what's sometimes called intentional stillness. The protocol is simple. Set a timer for 10-15 minutes, no phone, no music, no journaling. Just sit or walk slowly in silence. Let your thoughts come and go. You're not trying to stop them. You're observing them. That act of observing, without reacting or escaping, builds what psychologists call meta-awareness, your ability to notice your thoughts without becoming them. You'll find that this practice is not always relaxing. In fact, it often brings up restlessness, irritation, boredom, or even waves of unresolved emotion. But that's exactly the point. You're training your capacity to stay present without needing to suppress, fix, or distract yourself from discomfort, and that capacity carries over into every domain of life: relationships, work, performance, decision-making. From a neuroscience perspective, the repeated engagement of quiet reflection strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, planning, and impulse control. It also improves communication between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system to make you LOSE your RESPONSES. The result, you become less reactive, more intentional, and more grounded under pressure. Importantly, solitude is not isolation. Social connection is essential for mental health. But solitude is different. It's a voluntary, structured space for internal processing, and when done deliberately, it enhances, not replaces, your ability to connect meaningfully with others. You stop outsourcing your emotional stability to external sources and instead start generating clarity and regulation from within. In our current environment, where distraction is constant and input is endless, building a relationship with solitude is increasingly rare. But that rarity makes it powerful. When you cultivate the ability to sit quietly with yourself, you train your nervous system to stop scanning for the next hit of novelty and instead settle into depth. And that depth creates a stable foundation for strength that doesn't waver with circumstance. It's worth noting, the first few times you try this, it won't feel productive. Your mind will wander. You might feel like you're wasting time, but that's part of the retraining process. You're rewiring your brain away from short-term stimulation and toward long-term clarity and control. The benefits: more mental space, more emotional flexibility, and more resilience under stress accumulate over time. So if your goal is to build immense inner strength, start here. Create space, create silence, and learn to listen to yourself when the world is quiet. Because the better you get at being alone, the stronger you become in every situation, especially when it counts. Stress is not the enemy. In fact, it's one of the most powerful tools we have for adaptation, learning, and growth, if it's used properly. The problem is not that stress exists. The problem is that most people don't know how to regulate it or reframe it in the moment when it actually matters. Inner strength is not about avoiding stress, but about transforming it into fuel, and that transformation starts with how we perceive it as it's happening. When you're in a stressful situation, your body enters a state of heightened arousal. Your heart rate increases, your breathing accelerates, and your body releases adrenaline and cortisol. That's your sympathetic nervous system doing its job, preparing you to act. This is useful. It gives you energy, focus, and reaction speed. But without top-down control from the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, this stress can spiral into overwhelm, panic, or emotional reactivity. Inner strength is about being able to recognize when stress is rising and apply cognitive control in real time. That control is not suppressing the stress response, but reframing it. This reframing isn't just psychological, it has physiological consequences. Studies have shown that how you interpret your bodily signals during stress, for example, my heart is pounding, I must be panicking, vs. my heart is pounding, I'm getting ready to perform, actually changes your hormonal output and performance outcomes. One of the most effective ways to build this skill is through a practice called cognitive reappraisal. It's simple but powerful. When you're in a moment of pressure, an argument, a performance situation, a workout, or a high-stakes decision, pause and consciously reframe the meaning of the signals you're experiencing. Instead of interpreting stress as a threat, label it as activation. For example, if you're about to speak in public and your heart is racing, say to yourself, "This is my body preparing to help me focus and perform." That shift in interpretation reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, and increases communication between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. That allows you to maintain composure and control even as your system remains highly activated. It's important to understand that your brain is always creating a narrative, especially under stress. If you don't consciously shape that narrative, your brain will default to old patterns. And if those patterns are based on fear, avoidance, or inadequacy, your stress response will work against you. But if you practice reframing consistently, you create a new internal script, one that turns pressure into purpose. Another powerful tool here is interoceptive labeling, naming the physical sensations you're experiencing in a moment of stress. Research has shown that simply identifying what's happening in your body, e.g., my chest feels tight, my palms are sweating, I feel tension in my jaw, activates the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, which are involved in self-awareness and emotion regulation. Labeling your state creates a space between sensation and reaction. That space is where control lives. This ability to observe, label, and reframe in real time doesn't just reduce stress. It transforms it into a training signal. Every time you stay centered in the middle of a difficult moment, you're reinforcing new neural pathways. You're telling your brain, this is not danger, this is challenge, and I'm built for it. Over time, your nervous system becomes more efficient at returning to baseline after stress and more effective at performing under pressure. You can also strengthen this capacity through pre-exposure visualization. Before entering a known stressful situation, visualize yourself experiencing the physiological signs of stress: racing heart, shallow breath, sweaty palms. But instead of reacting negatively, imagine yourself welcoming those signals. Mentally rehearse reframing them as signs of readiness. This primes the brain to respond with control instead of panic when the actual moment arrives. Importantly, none of this requires perfection. The goal isn't to eliminate stress or never feel overwhelmed. The goal is to shorten the time between reaction and regulation. The quicker you can recognize what's happening, label it, and reframe it, the faster you regain control. So inner strength isn't about appearing calm. It's about actually being calm on the inside even when everything outside feels uncertain. And that's not a matter of personality or mindset. That's the result of deliberate neural training. You're teaching your brain and body to interpret stress as preparation, not punishment. And once you make that shift, you can start using stress as a performance enhancer instead of a limiter. Real-time reframing isn't just a trick. It's a skill. One that compounds over time and becomes a cornerstone of unshakable inner resilience. The biggest mistake people make when trying to become consistent, focused, or disciplined is relying on how they feel. They wait until they feel motivated. They wait until they're in the right mood. But the truth is, your emotional state is one of the least reliable sources of direction when it comes to taking action. Inner strength is built when your behavior is no longer dictated by your emotional state, but by something more stable: protocols. A protocol is a structured set of behaviors that you execute regardless of how you feel. These are not rigid routines, they're flexible systems designed to preserve energy, reduce decision fatigue, and align your actions with your long-term goals. The beauty of a protocol is that it takes willpower out of the equation. You don't have to decide each day whether to act. You simply follow what you've already committed to. This works because of how the brain processes decision-making and effort. Every time you have to choose whether or not to do something hard, your brain engages the prefrontal cortex, a powerful but energy-intensive area responsible for executive function. The more decisions you have to make in a day, the faster this system fatigues. That's why successful, resilient individuals reduce decision-making through pre-commitment and protocolization. When you follow a protocol, you're engaging in what's known as goal-directed behavior. This is controlled by a circuit that connects the prefrontal cortex with the basal ganglia, a structure deep in the brain that governs habits, motor patterns, and repetitive actions. Over time, following a protocol builds automaticity. The behavior becomes less cognitively demanding and more ingrained. That's the neurobiological basis for what we call discipline. It's important to understand that motivation is a state, but protocol is a system. States fluctuate, systems stabilize. If you only work out when you feel pumped or only study when you feel focused, you'll be wildly inconsistent. But if you build a time-bound, repeatable system, I train at 7 a.m. for 45 minutes 5 days a week, regardless of how I feel, you externalize the demand onto a fixed structure. That's where consistency is born. One protocol that's highly effective for building inner strength is what's sometimes called the minimum viable protocol. This means you identify the absolute smallest version of your routine that still creates forward motion. For example, if your normal training session is 60 minutes, your minimum protocol might be a 15-minute bodyweight circuit. If your writing goal is 1,000 words, your minimum might be 100. The key is not breaking the chain. Even on your worst days, you show up and execute the smallest version. This keeps the identity intact. I'm someone who shows up. That identity formation is neurologically real. Each time you complete a protocol, especially when you don't feel like it, you activate reward circuits in the brain. Dopamine is released not just when you succeed, but when you take action aligned with your goals. Over time, this reshapes how you view yourself. You're no longer someone who needs to feel inspired to take action. You're someone who acts because that's who you are. Another advantage of protocols is that they lower psychological resistance. When the brain knows exactly what to expect, stress is reduced. Ambiguity, should I train today, when what should I do, is mentally taxing. Protocols eliminate ambiguity and provide what the nervous system craves under stress: predictability. It's worth emphasizing that protocols don't have to be perfect. In fact, perfection is the enemy of execution. Your protocol can evolve, adapt, and adjust as your goals or circumstances change. What matters is that you have a default mode of action, something you return to even when life feels chaotic. This is why elite performers, from special operations to Olympic athletes to scientists, are so big on structure. They don't train or work based on how they feel in the moment. They train and work based on what their protocols demand. And the irony is that structure creates freedom. You're not stuck waiting for a good day. You create good days by acting in alignment with your protocol. The brain loves novelty, but it thrives on repetition. When you wire in protocols that support your goals, you start operating from a place of clarity and control rather than mood or motivation. That's when your inner strength becomes visible, not as a temporary surge, but as a sustained presence. The ultimate test of resilience isn't how well you perform when you feel good. It's how consistently you show up when you don't. That consistency, built on the back of well-designed protocols, becomes your foundation. Over time, it's not just what you do, it becomes who you are. One of the most powerful ways to build inner strength real, lasting resilience is through the deliberate construction of identity. Not identity in the abstract sense of personality or preferences, but in the behavioral, neurological sense. Who are you repeatedly teaching your brain you are based on what you do every single day? Your brain is not just tracking your goals, it's tracking your actions. Every time you follow through, especially when it's difficult, you send a message to your nervous system, this is who I am. And over time, those small actions hardwire your identity in a way that changes your behavior, your confidence, and your capacity to handle stress. This is because identity isn't built in moments of intensity. It's built through consistency, especially in low friction, repeatable behaviors. What researchers sometimes call small wins or micro habits are actually powerful neurological inputs. They shape the basal ganglia, the brain region responsible for habit formation and automaticity. The more consistently you execute a behavior, the less energy it takes, and the more it becomes part of your default mode. There's also a powerful connection between behavior and belief. Most people assume belief precedes behavior, that once you believe you're strong or focused, you'll act that way. But neuroscience and behavioral science suggest it works the other way around. You act your way into believing. You do the thing, even a small version, and your brain updates its internal model. I must be the kind of person who does this. For example, someone who meditates for 5 minutes every morning is not just gaining the physiological benefits of meditation. They're reinforcing the identity, I'm someone who trains my mind. Someone who writes 100 words a day, even when tired, isn't just making progress on a project, they're building the belief, I show up when it matters. These small wins compound not just externally, but internally. One of the most important elements of this process is deliberate consistency. This doesn't mean perfection. It means showing up daily in a way that's realistic, sustainable, and repeatable. You don't need to crush every workout. You need to do something every day that signals to your brain that your goals still matter, even when motivation is low or conditions aren't perfect. This is especially critical under stress. When you're under pressure, sick, anxious, or overwhelmed, your nervous system is scanning for cues. It wants to know, are we falling apart or are we still in control? A small, deliberate action, even a 5-minute routine, tells the system we're still choosing to move forward. That input changes your neurochemistry. It anchors your identity in stability, not in the chaos of the moment. One useful protocol here is creating a daily identity ritual. This is a small, non-negotiable action that connects directly to the person you want to become. For example, a short cold shower to reinforce mental toughness, journaling 3 sentences to reinforce clarity and reflection, stretching for 5 minutes to reinforce physical care, reading a page of a book to reinforce intellectual curiosity. These aren't performance metrics, they're identity signals. You're not doing them to win the day. You're doing them to win the relationship with yourself. And when repeated daily, they start to transform the brain's sense of who you are, not based on emotion, but based on evidence. Another layer to this process is self-directed neuroplasticity. This is the brain's ability to rewire itself based on what you repeatedly do and focus on. Each time you successfully complete a small task, even when you don't feel like it, you're strengthening the neural circuits for focus, perseverance, and control. That's not willpower, that's training, and the more you do it, the less reliant you are on external conditions to perform. You begin to shift from a reactive identity, one based on mood or stress, to a resilient identity, one based on agency and consistency. And when your identity becomes your anchor, it becomes much harder to get thrown off course. You stop asking, can I handle this? And start telling yourself, this is what I do. That is the essence of inner strength. It's not about being invincible. It's about being reliable to yourself. It's about knowing that even on your worst days, you have a foundation to stand on, the evidence of hundreds of small choices that built something unshakable. Not overnight, not all at once, but one small win at a time. Inner strength is not a feeling, it's an identity. And you build it daily.